you were thinking about Chinese and we were thinking about English as different flavors of expression and the degree to which they structure our ability to express ourselves and therefore our ability to have particular kind of social understanding. Yes. And here our poet is talking about the cracking, and as the words crack and sometimes break under the burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish. Right? This, and I also like scolding, mocking, or merely chattering, these shrieking voices in the desert. That we are feeling. I mean, we felt this in the social media world, right? That's the language breaking down, the shrieking, the crying, the cracking. But you're exploring with the Chinese is also the degree to which our framing by way of the language that we're speaking is cracking.
We've talked about this problem before. What happens when a nation becomes an imperial power? So it breaks the boundary of territory to become imperial. Then when it does that, it starts to absorb other nations into it. So it's like our language is doing that all the time. It's not in isolation of itself. Once it's being exposed to people that are speaking that language. Going back to the idea of like a multiple personality. But I mean, it's just the idea of foundational population. Okay, so we talk about that, but then it's like the foundational language of that population, which is problematic because we can't crystallize the language. It's not going to be put into cryogenic storage, or it can't be kept and held away from influence of. So
that's what the poet was saying.
Yes.
Words move, music moves only in time, but that which is only living can only die. That he's thinking about this problem of the movement in time, that music is dead if it's not in time as well. That the language has to be breathed to be alive, but in being alive, it's going to be changed.
Yeah, if I learn Italian from people in Italy versus if I learn Italian from the nonnas that migrated here, I'm basically going to be learning different dialects. So you can understand them. Of course, you're going to speak the language in a standard way if you want, but the influence is going to be different because in that language have been completely different. So you can cordon off a demographic, prevent it from having any foreign exposure whatsoever, prevent it from being mongrelized. This idea of keeping it pure. It makes no sense in an imperial context. And I think it was Mel that posted the link that basically all speaking now are imperial languages unless they're Aboriginal languages, unless they're indigenous.
Right, and the Aboriginal. So yeah, Mel in the comments is saying empire language. And Casey, English is a language that resulted from the colonization of other languages. Then it linguistically colonized the world. Mel says Gutenberg the world. Yeah, anybody who's had in linguistics class will say that's the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And it's like, no, this is not. Eskimos have bazillion words for snow, and therefore it changes the way they think about, they are able to perceive snow. So what my version of this is, we're talking about all our online fights, which is appropriate because the speech, right? This sort of digital speech that we're caught up in the internet, and sort of the conversations that you have in the media structure that we get online and Telegram and things like that. The impatience I get to is fine. You're complaining about the loss of culture, make some, right? Mm-hmm. And I think now I can't remember whether we've talked about this here, or I'll say, it's like the primary cultural gift technique. But no, I'm losing a word, right? The primary cultural thing that English did was create iambic pentameter verse. That's it, right? If you're going to be proud of something because you're of English heritage, one way or the other, everything that they have, like their music, their architecture, their Christianity, all of that's taken from other cultures. E. Michael Jones has some, nice comments in his book on beauty, how painting is Italian and music is, this German development. And Haydn has to come to England and write the Messiah for them because there's no like local guys who are doing Bach level or Beethoven level. If you think about it, German music is German, Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn, and maybe it's a little Hungarian list. Painting is Italian. Poetry of the sort that we're trying to learn to write in the Dragon Common Room is the great, literally English, artistic form.
Yeah.
So Chaucer and Shakespeare and Milton and, Pope. If you want to be participating in that thing that you claim that is yours primarily because you have this language, which has gone around the world and everybody speaks it, got to be doing it in iambic pentameter, because otherwise you're not in fact exploring the true depth of this magical thing that we have, which is our words and our syntax.
The poetry was a kind of outlet for them to achieve mystical transcendence that they'd lost. Protestantism and their addiction to philosophy.
So I'm reading from T.S. Eliot, right? And among other things, Eliot is known for a famous poem called The Wasteland, which was his depressing one. I chose a different set working from tonight, which is the 4 quartets, which are his most mature poems, and interestingly, the ones that had the most. So they're probably the ones that earned him the Nobel laureate in poetry. But they also had a very divided reception, because people had gotten used to him in the early 1920s being depressed and fraught and Joycean in his mixing of languages and things like that. Joyce and he were friends, so after they didn't like each other to start with, and then they ended up liking each other. But what he ends up with in the 4 quartets is, one, he's converted to Anglicanism. So he's converted from his Unitarianism that he grew up with in St. Louis. I've infinity for Eliot, because we were both born in the same city, right? He's born in St. Louis on the river, the Mississippi. He says that he felt affected by that his whole life, with the sort of first 16 years of his life, and then he went off to study in England. So he becomes the most English there is, right? He's sort of an American who goes and becomes as English as you can be, because he converts to Church of England, although he and at some point describes himself as an Anglo-Catholic. So we're delving deep into Englishness by way of its spirituality and its religion. And what the 4 quartets is one of my favorite compositions of any. It's not in iambic pentameter. I'm not sure what it's in, but apparently English critics liked it, and Americans were kind of hesitant because it's so clearly Christian, right? By the end, when you get to the dove passage that I read, he is re-mythologizing the English language into this depth of understanding. And this is what started this thing off. He also, I can't remember how I saw this. I think it was a movie. I'm not sure, or something I was reading. He did a series of lectures one year in Oxford on the metaphysical poets, right? That he was trying to, I think it's a weird book. I tried reading it. It makes no sense. He kind of almost didn't do it because he kind of didn't do the research, and then he was locked in a house and he tried to write it, and he finally gave the lectures and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that he's really wrestling with, our identity, right? St. Louis, Mississippi, American identity in English. What do you do with this language and this faith, and where is it coming from? I think that's what these poems are wrestling with, which is why things like he's worrying about how the language works, time, what we could do with it. It's all this sort of layering into exactly what it means to be English at all.
The Anglo identity crisis.
The Anglo identity crisis is Eliot. And so when Jones is saying, it's like they lose the English with the Reformation and the destruction of the monasteries, they lose the anchoring in the prayer practice, which is what we're talking about in my medieval England class, right? The founding of the monasteries in the first century of Christianity in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. And after those are destroyed in the 16th century, you get Shakespeare trying to write some kind of mythology into the plays without getting his head chopped off. And then English has been struggling ever since to find that place of, well, it's just strange when you're talking about Chinese, that Chinese jar still moves perpetually in its stillness. That there's something, there's this longing for the anchor that we've lost, which fits our theme.
It does.
Sailing around in the internet trying to find Shanti, which is famously in the wasteland, right? Peace.
Well, this is the problem. Like, Australia is the Anglo identity crisis, perfected.
Yep.
Because a lot of Australians of Celtic descent will call themselves Anglo, in the distinction between Celts and Anglo-Saxons. They don't actually understand
Right.
the distinction between the Welsh and the English, the Scottish, the Irish. Even though they'll say, "Oh, I'm part Scottish and part Irish and part Welsh," but not really understanding the ethnic distinctions that they're talking about. And
Mm-hmm.
then in a like Anglo-Aussies, as though this encompassed all Australians prior to the mass migration down here, which I find really fascinating. I was talking to a woman, she's from New York, she's a Black American woman, and she was saying something about the tragedy that she doesn't speak her ancestral language, which is something that someone else we'll talk about today has mentioned. Our ancestral languages were speaking in English and it was tragic. And I responded to her and said, "Yeah, I know, I don't speak mine either. It's terrible, isn't it?" And she was shocked, polite acknowledgement, but I don't think it really sunk into to her what I meant by that. Right. Yeah, so adopting Chinese, it's sort of like when it comes to that conversation on nationalism, you say, oh, okay, so you're going to learn foreign language now. I say, well, no, we've always been learning foreign languages. This right. is what I'm doing is I'm stepping out of one imperial language into another language, changing the guard in terms of the imperial tongue that we're going to be using.
So interesting. I'm thinking about this because my class today on campus was Bede and his ecclesiastical history of the English people, Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum. I hope that's right. It's in Latin, not English. And what's interesting about it is, one, what we barely know anything about the Anglo-Saxons, where they come from, who knows. King Arthur is in fact their enemy, or trying to hire them as mercenaries, hard to tell if King Arthur exists, right? The Anglo-Saxons come out of literally nowhere in terms of the stories that we have of them. It's a migration period, right? You're talking about the people that are in Australia and they've lost who they are. Like Anglo-Saxon origins is losing who they were. They have no stories of where they came from, except for when you finally get Beowulf written down in the 11th century. And there's a whole, I'm also reading right now a new translation of Beowulf, which is trying to show the old English layering underneath when we try to translate into modern English, and how much of the world that we lose. But that whole world is lost. It's gone. It's imaginary. It's mythical. It's an aura, right? And so one of the other things we're doing in the medieval England class is reading Michael Wood's In Search of England essays, and he had this essay on what it was like, what's like to visit Jarrow now, where Bede lived, and how it's, up there in the north of England, and it's all industrialized, topical for our empire. And the people who come to the little study center that they have where the monastery was, the school groups and such, they don't know anything about Christianity, apparently. I guess the Anglican Church is not doing terrifically well, despite Eliot and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, not so much because he was Catholic, but the early 20th century efforts to put some robustness back into the cultural life. So they don't know what a monastery was. They like the animals. They're trying to get an aura of something or other. Well, the everything that Bede is describing, he's written in Latin, and it's in fact projected onto, guess what, Rome and the Holy Land, Francia to a certain extent, Gaul and such. It's like English begins in a loss of identity when Bede is writing in, guess what, the imperial language, right? So his history of the English begins with when Caesar, came to Britain, and everything that he does in his scholarship, in his life, and even in his stories about how we English became Christian, is about incorporating them into this empire, and learning Latin, and that they have abbots and archbishops that come from North Africa and Tarsus, right, and now Turkey, Cilicia, that teach them Latin and Greek, right? So it's sort of almost to be English is to be in this not only imperial context, but in this loss of your ancestral identity thanks to migration.